My name is Gabriel Dusil. I am co-founder of a company called Adel. And I wanted to give you basically an update of what we do and also maybe teach you a little bit about what's going to happen to all of you in the future. Before we get into blockchain, often people talk about Bitcoin. So you guys, of course, if you know blockchain, you know Bitcoin. I've seen an amazing rise in the success of Bitcoin in the last few months, actually. There was a stagnation of Bitcoin value for about 3 years at about $800. And then we moved into a very big growth phase, almost a tripling of the value of Bitcoin to 2,500 euros, depending on how you look at it. Despite the success of Bitcoin, there's a lot of speculation about what the future of Bitcoin is. And one thing I think is really important to realize is that Bitcoin has changed the paradigm of money. Bitcoin now makes money into an app. So what does that mean, right? What does money in an app mean? Imagine the European Union saying, we are going to now upgrade the euro to version 2. Right? Sounds funny, right? Why would you? Euro is money. There's no version 2 of any money. That you just have money, and you can print new money, and you can maybe change the currency for a country. But basically, there's no upgrade to any money. But once money is an app, then everything is upgradable. Features are upgradable. The infrastructure is upgradable. The security is upgradable. And the reality is that Bitcoin right now is still a baby in the big scheme of things. Bitcoin exists for maybe 9 years, 8 years, 2009, so that's 8 years. Those of you that have experience with Bitcoin, you realize the infancy of Bitcoin. The level of service from a banking perspective is just not there yet. There's a lot of hoops you need to jump through. There is regulatory issues. There is know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering requirements now that are coming in. And even when those aspects of Bitcoin aren't there, you still have services that just aren't mature enough. And that's really a reflection of a market that is 8 years old. Similar to many of you probably don't remember because you're all young, but I started out in the internet in 1993, and the internet was immature as well. I remember people saying to me, you know, Gabriel, the internet is a big pile of junk, right? There's nothing on the internet, there's nothing useful. And I said to my colleagues, look, the internet is like a library. When you walk into a library, how many books are actually useful to you, right? Maybe 0.001% of the books are useful to you specifically. And then 0.001% of for somebody else is useful in the library, different books than for you. And that's what the internet is just really basically finding the part of the internet that's useful to you, and the rest of it is real junk. And there's a certain part of the internet where it's junk for everybody. But but this is as the internet matured, nobody talks about the internet being immature or useless, right? We all find the use of the internet in the same way that Bitcoin, we will find the use of Bitcoin in the future. Despite the bad press that you hear about Bitcoin, you know, it fuels terrorism. The anonymity basically fuels money laundering and other types of criminal activities. We believe that that's just going to be redefined in the next 5 years as Bitcoin becomes more legitimate. Right now it's kind of binary. It's either good or bad to some people. But there's going to be a gray area, and we're going to get to the point where Bitcoin and blockchain aren't going to be just viewed as evil or good in a binary sense. So this is really the spike that I was just talking about. Bitcoin was fairly steady up until about May of this year, and then it started to really go up. And now I'm quite certain that a lot of your friends that didn't know about Bitcoin 3 months ago are now hearing about it a lot, right? For this 3 months, this big spike has really brought a lot of attention to people that just didn't care about it and are wondering what's going on. What's going to happen in the future is not really certain, but we're basically around 2,500 2,500 euros, depending on what you're looking at. Why all this Bitcoin blockchain hype? And really what we're trying to do in this industry is trying to explain the difference between the two. When Bitcoin was coming out, Bitcoin was the app for blockchain, and people didn't really know the difference because the app came out first, right? In the same way, in the internet, when email came out, people didn't really know the difference between, the communication in the internet in the early 90s with what the internet was, until more apps came out, and then they realized, oh, okay, internet is kind of the foundation, and on top of that are these apps. And that's the same thing that's happening with Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin has been the app for the blockchain, and real innovation is really around this blockchain. It's automated. There's the blockchain is communicated between the different nodes. It's decentralized, so if any node goes down, then it still survives. There is cryptography. There's public and private key in terms of keeping it secure. There's hash functions, and hash is basically a fingerprint of a document, right? So and it's the unique fingerprint to that document. You can't create the document from the hash, but you can determine whether that document has been changed if the fingerprint's not matching the original document. Okay, it's a security measure. It's permissionless, just like the internet. You can join without permission, generally speaking. Okay, we can debate that, but it's a permissionless network. But there are now private blockchains that are also coming out to basically work in banking communities. A lot of banks are looking at creating their own blockchain because it's open source. It's immutable, which means that you can't change the data once you've done the transaction and you've recorded the transaction. That stays there forever, right? Forever, in the sense that the blockchain is a representation or an open ledger from the beginning of its creation until the internet falls apart, if the internet falls apart. So there's an immutable record of these transactions. So it's a database in a sense that you're logging information into the database, but if you're going to make changes, you're not replacing data. You're basically saying, okay, this was the original data. I'm going to update the data in a future block, but the history of that change is represented throughout the blockchain. Okay, am I going too fast here, or am I going too slow? It's trusted in the sense that if you trust the technology of blockchain, then you basically trust how the technology works. And trust is a funny thing to use in blockchain because Satoshi Nakamoto is the guy that wrote the white paper that basically created this programmable trust to prevent duplicate transactions and so on. But for you guys that are in blockchain, you know quite well that trust is still an issue, right? And the issue is not with the blockchain itself from a trust standpoint. It's with the people that get involved above the blockchain, right? As you guys know, in the banking community, you have technology, then you have a services layer, then you have people, right? And these layers above is where trust starts to essentially break down when people get involved and they start to jeopardize the trust of the network. So blockchain itself is very trustworthy because the technology is very sound, but the layers above start to compromise that trust in a big picture perspective. It's verified, it's cross-checked. Each transaction is verified multiple times. There's a protection against double spending. That was one of the original aspects of the white paper. And there's an authentication of each of the transactions. So it's an amazing technology. And in the big scheme of things, blockchain is probably, in my view, the most fundamental changing technology since the creation of the internet. I mean, I would challenge anybody in this room to present a technology in the last 25 years that has received so much attention like the blockchain. There's tens of thousands of proof of concepts happening right now in blockchain. And I haven't seen any of this happen in any other technology that has come up since the creation of the internet and TCP/IP and these technologies. This is just an example of a block in a blockchain. You have a header, timestamp, a nonce, which is basically a random number to basically randomize the security, or the hash, transactions. You can have hundreds of transactions in a single block. The first one is called the genesis block in a blockchain. Then you basically hash that block once it's been created, and you add that hash to the next block. So if anybody tries to change that block, then the next block will basically not pass a verification because the hash function will fail, and then everything after it basically is no longer trusted. Right? So this chain of hashes basically ensures that the transactions from the very beginning to the genesis block are secure, because if anybody tries to change any block, then every hash will fail after that block. So it's quite phenomenal from that standpoint. Right now it takes about 10 minutes. It takes 10 minutes to mine a block in blockchain, and that these days is considered to be very slow. The new blockchains that are being created are looking at mining within seconds block, not even a minute. Even a minute is slow these days. And there's also these ASICs that have been created specifically for blockchain. ASIC is help me out, ASIC, application specific integrated circuit. See, my engineering came back. Specifically created to 10, 100, 1,000-fold increase the processing capability of creating these blocks. And there's huge factories, let's say these data centers that are used specifically just to mine these blocks. It's phenomenal. In fact, it's kind of hard to gauge the processing power, but there was a study that somebody did last year around July. They said that the processing power of the Bitcoin blockchain is 43,000 times more powerful than the top 500 supercomputers in the world combined. 43,000 times more powerful. And there's some dispute there because one is using integers and one is using discrete numbers. So they're trying to kind of compare apples to oranges to find out the processing power. And so you're looking at basically around anywhere between 5 and 10,000 nodes around the world that are processing these blockchains. This is an example of a block. You have total number of transactions, over 1,000, how much was transacted in terms of dollars, let's say, transaction fees, timestamp, okay, and this is the reward that miner got for that blockchain at that value at that time. We're in a stage in banking, in government, where Bitcoin is viewed as evil because of its anonymity, because of its deregulated nature, is a cause for concern. It's in competition directly with currencies, government currencies and banking currencies. And so that's an issue. But blockchain is, as a technology, a huge opportunity for banks, and they're looking at it very closely. So what's happened is that the governments are trailing in terms of the regulatory measures to regulate this whole industry. And how do you regulate an industry that is literally decentralized, so you can't turn it off, and you have a very strong aspect of anonymity, people that want to be anonymous in this scenario, right? So that's an issue. Scalability is becoming an issue. I think the blockchain of Bitcoin is around 80 gigabytes right now, and it's growing. So as it grows in popularity, this blockchain increases substantially, and there's actually charts you can see on blockchain.info to see how the blockchain changes in other aspects. And there's all these proof of concepts. What's going to happen with the proof of concepts of blockchain? They're in multiple vertical markets, and it's not really certain which ones are going to succeed. But the reality is that because you have tens of thousands of proof of concepts, something is going to emerge in whether it's healthcare or government or banking, where there's going to be a good use for the blockchain, and others will fail because blockchain, for example, doesn't do great in terms of thousands of transactions per second, if that's what you're looking for. So this will be a learning process for many industries. But there's a lot of efficiency because a lot of middlemen are taken out of the process by implementing blockchain, upsetting a lot of people that are in the middlemen part of the industry. There's a lot of cost savings because you're talking about open source and a very efficient, very well architected technology. But of course it still needs to be integrated into systems. And one of the biggest aspects of blockchain in terms of opportunity is the big data analysis, because we're seeing that blockchain can do a lot of good from a humanitarian aspect when countries start to chain their blockchains, right? So one country may have a land registry for their country using blockchain. Another country may use it the same. And so to have like an international land registry, or to have international medical records to look at the propensity of cancer based on age and location and other aspects. So the whole information sharing aspect has a lot of potential, putting aside, of course, the privacy issues and so on that still need to be worked out. But the good thing is that blockchain, you can have encrypted data, encrypted blocks, and you can have non-encrypted blocks. So there is the flexibility to maintain privacy from that standpoint. So here's just an example of some banks that are looking at blockchain, investing in blockchain startups, creating blockchain projects to see how it could fit into their organization. And this is probably 3 times, 4 times even bigger than this chart. But just to give an example that blockchain is really being looked at by a lot of industries, especially in the banking sector. Because you're thankfully in a sector that is usually one of the first movers in new technology, because you have a need, right? You have a need from a security perspective, you have a need to keep updated. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, it's usually governments that are the slowest to implement new technology. So you're at one end, governments are at the other end, and in between you have everybody else, all the other vertical sectors. And you have the most money to invest in this stuff, so there's that as well, right? This is an adoption curve. As you see in adoption of other technologies, you have basically innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, right? You've seen this probably a lot of times. We can look at this from the standpoint of blockchain specifically. Blockchain was born in 2008 with the white paper from Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know who he is really, but that was his alias. And then around 2013, basically something happened. And what happened in 2013 is a whole bunch of people suddenly got a light in their head saying, something's going on here, I want to get involved. And it's people like Waves and Lisk and Ethereum and even investors that didn't have actually any specific innovation. They all started here. Something happened there. Not me, I wasn't there yet. I started just 18 months ago, so I came late to the game. But from the current scheme, which is where we are now, which is the early adopters. Okay, so we are looking at a time frame of, let's say, about 9-10 years of early adopters before blockchain becomes mainstream. And this is not just us talking about it. In Adel, also analysts are saying that around 5 years from now, blockchain is going to become mainstream. And of course, the value of Bitcoin, the anticipation of it going to $10,000 will also help bringing it into the mainstream as well. So this is where we believe we're at. We believe we're right in the middle of this early adopter stage of the adoption of blockchain. And for those of you that are familiar with crossing the chasm, companies are trying to go from startup stage to mainstream stage. This is actually right where the crossing the chasm also occurs. And that's some people survive crossing and some people don't. So we will see. We'll see what happens. There's another curve called the hype cycle, which is also called an adoption curve. You probably have seen it from Gartner Research. And this is an interesting aspect because Gartner basically in 2016 put blockchain right about here. They haven't released 2017 yet because they released it in July, so probably next month they'll release it. So it's going to be interesting if they put blockchain on this side or at the top. We're not really sure. But let's say we're right on the top of this curve where we have tens of thousands of proof of concepts. We're basically going down for the next 2 to 3 years, right? All these proof of concepts are going to disappoint a lot of people. The reality is that we are all expecting it to happen anyway, because that happens with every technology. There's this disappointment. And what emerges from that disappointment are the proof of concepts that say blockchain is working for us. Maybe it's 10% of the proof of concepts, maybe it's 20, who knows what the percentage is. There's going to be some percentage that are going to be disappointed and some that are going to say it's going to work. And even if it works within a certain organization, they may not have a culture to actually implement blockchain. But in my experience, I did 10 years in sales, 10 years in marketing, last 6 years in startups. And I'll tell you, when we came in with new technologies, one of our biggest hurdles was the person that we're selling to that had an empire underneath them in terms of people, money, budget, and either they're going to see our technology as a threat to their empire or as an opportunity to make their empire bigger, right? So there's the very much a human aspect to blockchain that even if it's perfect for their company, if that person that's making a decision sees that their position is in threat to be implemented, then it probably won't work in their company, even though it's perfect for them, right? Their agenda does not fit with the technology that you're trying to implement. And that's, who's anybody in sales here? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, this is a very real aspect that really nobody ever talks about, but it's an interesting aspect to this whole hype cycle. Okay, so where are we now? The person that maybe adopting the technology, let's say, is the head of IT. That person may realize that if there's efficiency and there's cost savings, their department will go from 1,000 people to 500, right? And they're like, okay, well, and what does that mean for them specifically if that reduction happens? Is their job also in jeopardy? So that person may not be the person making the decision, because are you making a decision because of you, or are you making a decision for your company? And that's a very real aspect to implementing any technology and understanding that personal agenda versus the agenda that they're trying to follow for the company. Nothing is going to be surprising when this happens in the next 2 to 3 years. But blockchain is blue, which means in 5 to 10 years it's going to reach this slope of enlightenment, which is this mainstream. So to get from here to here is about 5 years, maybe from 5 to 10 years, and here is maybe 3 to 5 years, and then we'll start to increase. Blockchain is disruptive, right? So is it an opportunity or is it a threat? And it's probably both. How you prepare yourself in the next 3 to 5 years to say, okay, here it's a threat, but we can mitigate that threat by changing our company in order to play a role. Because let's say you're playing the middleman role now, right? If you anticipate that change in 5 years, saying, okay, our clients are going to take us out of that whole process, but we have 3 years to fix it, so that the fact that we're not going to be there, I mean, fighting to stay there is going to be probably the wrong strategy, I would say. It's more about assuming that the industry is going to change to a certain extent, and where your new role has to play in the big scheme of things after that 5 years. And the good thing is the banking community are fast movers. I mean, generally speaking, you guys are fast movers from an industry perspective. So you can change better than most industries. Even though a lot of banks have a lot of people and there's the cultural aspects, but still, generally speaking, from an industry compared to other like healthcare industry or government, you generally have a chance to mold yourself into the new world. Is recognizing the threat, accepting it, and then saying, okay, this is what we need to do in 3 years in order to change what we're doing today in those next 3 years in order to accommodate that new world. Because even if it doesn't happen, it's going to happen probably in some capacity. But nobody really knows how it's going to shape. But the more you're prepared for it, then the better you're off.